My name is Irene Judson. I'm 42 years old. And last Mother's Day, my ex-husband stood up at a dinner table with 30 people watching, lifted his wine glass, and called me just a housewife. Then he laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not awkward laughter. Performance laughter. The kind designed to tell a room, you're allowed to laugh too. Some people did. My daughter didn't. Natalie was 19. Finance major at Ohio State. Dean's Honors Program. And for the previous 3 months, she had been quietly reading 16 years of tax returns, investment records, and bank statements her father never realized I kept copies of. Interesting thing about accountants. We don't argue emotionally. We document. And eventually, documents become impossible to ignore. At the far end of the restaurant table, my son Dylan stared at his plate like he wanted to disappear into it. 17 years old. Quiet kid. Too young to understand how dangerous rewritten history becomes inside families. My ex-mother-in-law Linda smiled into her wine glass. Satisfied. Like she'd finally heard the sentence she'd been feeding relatives for 4 years said publicly. Just a housewife. Interesting phrase, honestly. Because people only use the word just when they need to shrink someone else's value enough to feel larger themselves. I didn't cry. Didn't defend myself. Didn't storm out dramatically. I picked up my water glass calmly, took one sip, and asked Greg a single question. Are you finished? The room shifted immediately. Because confidence sounds unsettling when someone expects humiliation instead. Greg smirked. I'm just being honest. Interesting choice of words. Because people rewriting history always rename cruelty as honesty eventually. Then my daughter stood up. And everything changed. But honestly, that dinner only makes sense if you understand the 16 years before it. Because women don't become invisible overnight. It happens slowly. Administratively. One dismissed contribution at a time. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Middle child. 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Mother worked double shifts at a nursing home. Father left when I was 11. Interesting thing about growing up poor. You learn quickly that money isn't emotional. People are. Numbers simply reveal priorities. At 16, I bagged groceries at Kroger after school. At 17, I balanced my mother's checkbook because exhaustion made her forget due dates. At 19, I started community college while working 30 hours a week. Transferred to Ohio State later. Accounting degree. $43,000 in student loans. Paid off every cent by age 28. I met Greg Judson at 24. Corporate sales conference downtown. Navy suit. Easy smile. The kind of confidence men develop when life keeps rewarding them before they fully earn it. But honestly, Greg wasn't cruel at first. That's the dangerous part. He was charming. Attentive. Funny. He remembered details about people. Or at least, he remembered enough to appear thoughtful professionally. We married 18 months later. Small ceremony. Outdoor reception. My mother cried harder than I did. Greg kissed my forehead during the vows and whispered, "We're going to build something incredible together." Interesting sentence. Because technically, he was right. He just forgot who actually built most of it. Greg worked in medical equipment sales. Base salary plus commissions. Good money. Unpredictable money. Which meant someone needed to create stability underneath it. That someone became me. I handled everything financial from the second year of our marriage onward. Mortgage payments. Insurance negotiations. investment allocations, emergency savings, retirement planning, tax filings, college funds. Every dollar entering or leaving our household passed through spreadsheets I created. Greg deposited paychecks. That was his contribution to the financial system. I designed the system itself. Interesting difference. Because people confuse income generation with financial intelligence constantly. In 2008, when Natalie was 2, I opened her $529 college account through Vanguard. Automatic monthly contributions. $400 every month. Never missed one. Not during recessions. Not during layoffs. Not even when Greg's commission checks dropped after the hospital merger in 2011. In 2010, I opened Dylan's account too. Same structure. Same discipline. Same quiet consistency nobody noticed because consistency rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. Greg never asked questions. Honestly? That should have concerned me earlier. Whenever I tried explaining our finances, budget allocations, retirement projections, mortgage refinancing, he'd wave his hand dismissively. You handle it. Interesting phrase. Because delegation without acknowledgement becomes erasure eventually. At Thanksgiving 5 years ago, Greg performed the first public rewrite. His parents' house in Westerville. 22 people crowded into a dining room smelling like turkey grease and Linda's cinnamon candles. I walked in carrying homemade green bean casserole. From scratch. Because Linda's came from cans and somehow nobody criticized that tradition. Greg stood near the buffet with 2 coworkers beside him. Beer bottle in one hand. Other hand resting on my shoulder casually. This is Irene, he announced. Pause. She stays home with the kids. I handle everything else. Then he laughed. Loud. Performative. Permission laughter. And the room followed automatically. Interesting thing about social cruelty. Most people don't evaluate whether something is true before laughing. They evaluate whether it's socially safe first. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway holding that casserole dish. Heat from the glass burning through the towel wrapped around my hands. Nobody looking directly at me. Nobody correcting him either. And honestly, that moment changed something quietly inside me. Not dramatically. Not enough to leave. Just enough to begin documenting more carefully. Because somewhere deep down, I realized Greg enjoyed the version of me that sounded smaller publicly. Here's what nobody at that Thanksgiving table knew. The housewife had already built 2 fully funded college savings accounts, a 6-month emergency reserve, Roth IRAs for both spouses, and refinanced the mortgage at 4.1%, saving the family $38,000 long-term. Greg couldn't log into our bank account without asking me for the password. But apparently, he handled everything else. Interesting. The marriage didn't collapse dramatically. No screaming matches. No plates thrown across kitchens. Just erosion. Slow. Administrative erosion. Greg started spending more time with a coworker named Cheryl Morgan. Late dinners. Long calls. Texts after midnight. I confronted him once calmly. Showed him the phone records. 47 calls to Cheryl in 3 weeks. Greg immediately went defensive. You're overreacting. Interesting response. Because people crossing boundaries often accuse others of emotional instability before accountability arrives. We tried counseling. 8 sessions scheduled. Greg attended 2. During the second session, Dr. Whitman asked him a simple question. What does Irene contribute to the family? Greg shrugged slightly. She keeps the house running. Meals. laundry. That kind of thing. Then Dr. Whitman asked. And the finances? Greg smiled. I earn the money. Interesting moment, honestly. Because that was the exact second I understood something devastating. Greg genuinely believed depositing paychecks mattered more than managing an entire family's financial architecture. And honestly, once someone stops seeing your labor, they eventually stop seeing you too. 3 weeks later, I hired a divorce attorney. Rachel Emerson. Downtown Columbus. 18 years specializing in family law. Greg looked genuinely shocked when I told him. You don't even understand equitable distribution. I remember looking at him quietly across our kitchen table. Then answering. I filed our taxes for 16 years, Greg. Pause. I understand exactly how assets work. Interesting thing about accountants. People mistake our silence for confusion constantly. The divorce lasted 9 months. Greg hired a flashy attorney twice as expensive as mine. Didn't matter. Because family court rewards documentation more than volume eventually. I arrived at mediation with 3 binders. Color-tabbed. Year by year. Tax returns. Bank statements. Investment records. Mortgage schedules. Insurance histories. Every contribution documented clearly. The retired judge overseeing mediation raised one eyebrow when I placed the binders on the table. Is that all your documentation? 16 years, I answered calmly. Greg's attorney requested a recess 20 minutes later. In the settlement? The house sold. Assets split fairly under Ohio law. I retained control of the 529 accounts because I created and managed them. Greg kept his 401k. And honestly, I didn't want revenge. I wanted accuracy. Interesting difference. Because revenge is emotional. Accuracy is structural. The night the divorce finalized, I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Dylan asleep in the next room. Natalie at a friend's house. And I made copies of everything. Every tax return. Every investment statement. Every account summary. I sealed them inside a manila envelope. Wrote the date across the front in black Sharpie. September 14, 2022. Then slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk beneath old receipts and hanging folders. Not because I planned revenge. Not because I expected exposure someday. Because deep down, I understood something important. When only one person controls the story, eventually they start editing reality too. I just never expected my daughter would become the one to audit it. The divorce ended legally in September. But socially? Greg kept the marriage alive for 4 more years. Not through reconciliation. Through narration. Interesting thing about people obsessed with image. They rarely fight for the truth. They fight for the version that protects their ego publicly. The first rumor reached me through a text message. Diane from Rotary Club. Hey Irene, awkward question. Pause. Did Greg really support you completely for 16 years? Interesting. Because lies spread differently after divorce. Not dramatically. Casually. Like weather updates people repeat without checking first. Then came another message. Coworker's wife ran into Linda at the grocery store. Apparently, I had taken Greg to the cleaners. Interesting phrase. Because women receiving legally documented settlements suddenly become gold diggers the second they stop tolerating disrespect quietly. Greg's narrative was simple. Simple stories spread fastest. He worked. I stayed home. Court rewarded me unfairly. End of explanation. No mention of investment accounts. No mention of mortgage refinancing. No mention of 16 years of financial management. Because complicated truths lose against emotional simplicity unless someone forces the numbers into the room. Linda amplified everything. Of course she did. Greg's mother treated gossip like a community service project. At family events, church gatherings, grocery store conversations, she repeated the same lines carefully. She sat at home spending my son's money. Interesting wording. Because people who depend emotionally on their sons often describe wives like unauthorized expenses eventually. I wanted to fight back sometimes. Honestly? There were nights I stood in my kitchen holding my phone ready to call Linda and read tax returns line by line until sunrise. But Dr. Okafor kept repeating one sentence during therapy. Do not pull the children into a narrative war. Interesting advice. Because emotionally healthy people assume truth eventually reveals itself naturally. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it waits years for the right person to notice the discrepancy. At 13, Dylan started asking questions. Not naturally. Rehearsed questions. The kind children repeat after hearing adults discuss them elsewhere. Mom. Pause. Did Dad really pay for everything? I remember standing at the kitchen counter cutting onions for chile. Knife frozen halfway through a slice. Steam rising from the pot. And honestly? That question hurt more than the divorce papers ever did. Because betrayal from adults feels expected eventually. Hearing your child repeat the lie feels surgical. Your father and I contributed differently, I answered carefully. Dylan frowned slightly. But Dad says paying bills isn't really working. Interesting. Because invisible labor always becomes not real work once someone else benefits from it long enough. I sat across from my 13-year-old son quietly. Then explained. I opened your college account when you were 3 months old. Pause. I filed every tax return. Negotiated every insurance policy. Managed every dollar in this family. Dylan stared down at the table. Dad says that's just paperwork. Paperwork. Interesting word for financial infrastructure. I wanted to pull out every spreadsheet right there. Every account statement. Every tax return carrying Greg's signature beside my calculations. But Dr. Okafor's voice stayed in my head. Don't weaponize the children. So instead, I absorbed it quietly. Interesting thing about mothers. We often mistake silence for protection even when it's hurting us slowly. That night, after Dylan fell asleep, I sat on the bathroom floor crying silently against the bathtub. Not dramatic crying. Just exhaustion finally leaking somewhere private. Because my son genuinely believed his mother contributed nothing beyond casseroles and utility payments. And honestly, part of me feared the lie would win eventually simply because Greg repeated it louder. Then Cheryl arrived fully. 2 years after the divorce. Greg married her at a winery outside Columbus. I learned through Natalie. Sunday morning phone call. Voice tight. Dad got married yesterday. Pause. Cheryl wore a white pantsuit. Interesting detail. Because daughters always notice the unnecessary specifics when they're emotionally unsettled. Apparently Greg gave a speech about second chances. Interesting. Because men rewriting marriages love redemption narratives that erase the first wife's contribution completely. What hurt wasn't the wedding itself. Honestly? That marriage ended emotionally long before paperwork. What hurt came later. Instagram captions. Love my kid's red heart. Cheryl posting Dylan in new sneakers. Natalie beside brunch plates. Family selfies captioned. Starting fresh. Interesting phrase. Because apparently 16 years of motherhood can be overwritten socially with filters and hashtags now. Then Cheryl started telling people stories too. She's so brave starting over at her age. Translation. Financially unstable. Another favorite. I'm trying to give those kids stability. Interesting. Because women entering broken marriages sometimes convince themselves the first wife failed simply to justify participating in the wreckage. One night, Natalie called furious. Cheryl thinks you're broke. I laughed softly despite myself. I'm not broke. I know that. Pause. She doesn't. Interesting thing about financially literate daughters. Eventually they start noticing inconsistencies independently. Natalie began asking sharper questions during freshman year at Ohio State. Finance major. Dean's honors. The same analytical stillness I carried during tax season lived behind her eyes now. How do you afford the apartment on your salary? I budget. Dad says you got almost nothing in the divorce. Interesting. Because Greg wanted sympathy without documentation. Dangerous strategy once your child studies accounting. Your father and I divided assets legally, I answered carefully. That's not what he says. I know. Silence stretched across the phone line. Then Natalie asked quietly. Did Dad lie to us? Honestly? That question terrified me more than any courtroom ever did. Because once children ask directly, the family mythology starts cracking permanently. Your father believes his version, I answered carefully. Pause. I have documentation. Documentation. Interesting word choice maybe. But accountants trust records more than memory. Can I see it? When you're ready. What makes you think I'm not ready? Because she still called Greg every Sunday then. Still wanted both parents emotionally intact. And honestly? I wasn't prepared to become the parent who destroyed that illusion first. Then Easter happened. Linda's house. 40-year-old wallpaper. Polished dining table. Doilies everywhere like decorative surrender flags. I wasn't invited. Standard procedure by then. Dylan attended alone. When he returned home, he went directly to his room without dinner. No door slam. Just a quiet click. Interesting. Because the quietest hurt usually runs deepest in teenage boys. Natalie called the next morning before class. Grandma said something again. I closed my eyes instantly. What did she say? Silence first. Then. Thank God Greg found Cheryl. A real partner this time. Pause. Not someone who sat home spending his money. I gripped the phone harder against my ear. Interesting thing about repeated humiliation. It doesn't hurt less with practice. It just becomes more familiar structurally. She said that in front of Dylan? In front of everyone. Pause. Mom. Natalie's voice changed slightly then. Sharper. Not emotional anymore. Precise. That's not opinion. That's a false statement. Interesting moment. Because that was the first time my daughter stopped discussing family dynamics emotionally. And started evaluating them analytically. Like fraud. Like a discrepancy. Like numbers refusing to balance. For years. That's how long I stayed quiet publicly. Not silent. Quiet. Huge difference. Silent means absence. Quiet means restraint. Every time Dylan repeated Greg's words. Paper cut. Every time relatives hesitated awkwardly around me. Paper cut. Every Instagram caption rewriting motherhood. Paper cut. And honestly? Eventually enough paper cuts start resembling dismemberment emotionally. Still. I waited. Worked. Paid bills. Balanced ledgers. Because somewhere deep down, I believed truth eventually survives if someone intelligent finally examines the records carefully enough. That person became Natalie. And the trigger? Not family drama. Not gossip. A FAFSA form. Interesting. Because financial fraud rarely collapses from emotion. It collapses from documentation requests. Winter semester. Sophomore year. Natalie needed to renew financial aid paperwork. Standard procedure. The FAFSA required income disclosures from both divorced parents. I submitted my documents within 48 hours. Tax returns. W-2s. Investment summaries. Labeled clearly. Alphabetized PDFs. Craig stalled for 6 weeks. My accountant's busy. Things are complicated. I'll send it soon. Interesting thing about financially dishonest people. They delay before they deny. Eventually Greg emailed a partial income summary. 1 page. Large sections blacked out. Natalie stared at it for 2 hours. Finance majors notice patterns normal people ignore. Greg reported income dramatically lower than his visible lifestyle. New house in Dublin. Brand new Silverado. 10-day Cabo vacation Cheryl documented aggressively online. The numbers didn't match. And honestly? That's when my daughter officially became my daughter. Because when accountants see discrepancies, we investigate. Natalie drove home that Saturday morning at 8:15. Yellow legal pad. Mechanical pencil. Coffee waiting at the kitchen table. And one question. Mom. Pause. I need to see the divorce paperwork. I looked at her quietly. 20 years old. Sharp eyes. Already halfway to understanding everything. Then walked to my desk. Bottom drawer. Behind old receipts. The manila envelope still exactly where I left it 4 years earlier. Sharpie date still visible. September 14, 2022. Seal unbroken. Interesting honestly. Because truth had been sitting inside my apartment the entire time. Waiting for someone brave enough to open it. I handed the envelope to my daughter. And for the first time in 4 years, I stopped protecting Greg from the evidence. Natalie opened the envelope like evidence. Carefully. Methodically. Interesting thing about finance majors. They don't search for drama. They search for inconsistencies. The kitchen stayed quiet except for paper sliding against paper and the soft hum of the refrigerator behind us. Tax returns. Mortgage statements. Retirement account summaries. 529 contribution histories. Insurance documents. 16 years of financial architecture stacked across my kitchen table like invisible labor finally demanding witnesses. Natalie read everything for 4 straight hours. No phone. No music. No distractions. Just numbers. And honestly? Watching my daughter discover the truth felt strangely similar to attending your own funeral while still alive. Because every page proved something nobody defended publicly for 4 years. I built that family financially. Not emotionally alone. Structurally. Natalie stopped at the Vanguard statements first. Eyes narrowing slightly. Mom. Pause. You started my 529 before Dad's first promotion? Yes. She flipped pages faster afterward. Dylan's account. Emergency savings. Mortgage refinance documents. Then the retirement summaries. Interesting silence filled the room then. The kind produced when intelligence collides with betrayal. These contributions came from your salary. Mostly. Dad said you stopped working after I was born. Interesting. Because technically, Greg never defined work accurately. I reduced hours after Natalie's birth. Shifted into remote bookkeeping contracts. Freelance tax prep during filing seasons. Consulting for 3 small businesses from home while raising children and managing our finances simultaneously. Not glamorous work. Invisible work. But enough to keep retirement contributions steady every single year. Natalie stared down at the records silently. Then whispered. He lied. Honestly? That word hurt differently coming from her. Not because it was new. Because daughters saying it aloud makes denial impossible structurally. I sat across from her quietly. Sunlight moving slowly across the kitchen floor. Coffee growing cold beside untouched paperwork. And honestly? I still wanted to protect Greg slightly. Interesting instinct maybe. But mothers often continue emotionally cushioning fathers long after the marriage dies. Your father simplified things. Natalie looked up immediately. Sharp finance major eyes now. That's not simplification. Pause. That's fraud by omission. Interesting phrasing. Because suddenly my daughter stopped speaking like a hurt child. And started sounding like an auditor. She spent the next 3 weekends reconstructing 16 years of family finances. Not casually. Professionally. Spreadsheets. Cross-referencing. Contribution timelines. Comparative asset growth. Expense allocations. Interesting transformation honestly. Because grief becomes frighteningly efficient once intelligent people start organizing it mathematically. She called me Tuesday night during her second week back at Ohio State. Voice calm. Too calm. Mom. Pause. Did Dad know you funded 68% of both college accounts personally? I stared at the ceiling above my bedroom quietly. Yes. Another pause. He told us he paid for our futures. Interesting thing about children. They don't just grieve lies. They grieve the version of their parents those lies created emotionally. Natalie started uncovering details even I forgot. Insurance settlements I negotiated. Tax loss harvesting during the 2020 downturn. Mortgage interest deductions optimized across 8 filing cycles. Small decisions. Quiet decisions. The kind that compound into stability over decades while nobody applauds. One Friday afternoon. She drove home unexpectedly. Laptop bag over one shoulder. Dark circles beneath her eyes. And a thick printed spreadsheet clutched against her chest. I finished. Interesting sentence. Because auditors sound exhausted after truth finally balances correctly. She spread the pages across the dining table carefully. Color-coded categories. Highlighted contribution ratios. Asset growth projections. Everything documented cleaner than most forensic reports. At the bottom of the final page. One number circled in red ink. $347,218. I frowned slightly. What's that? Natalie looked directly at me. The estimated value Dad publicly erased. Silence. Huge silence. Because suddenly invisible labor had a measurable number attached to it. $347,000. Retirement optimization. Investment growth. Tax savings. College funding. Mortgage restructuring. Financial planning. 16 years. Interesting honestly. Because people dismiss domestic labor emotionally until accounting assigns market value to it. Natalie sat back slowly afterward. Then asked the question I dreaded most. Why did you let him say those things about you? Honestly? I didn't answer immediately. Because there's no clean explanation for how women disappear slowly inside marriages. Finally, I told the truth. I thought protecting you mattered more than correcting him. Natalie's eyes filled instantly. Not dramatic tears. Quiet devastation. Mom. Pause. You protected him. Not us. Interesting. Because children eventually understand silence differently than parents intend it. That sentence stayed with me for weeks afterward. You protected him. Not us. Meanwhile, Greg kept performing his rewritten narrative publicly. Rotary Club dinners. Golf outings. Neighborhood cookouts. Always the same version. Hardworking provider. Ungrateful ex-wife. Financial burden survived heroically. Interesting mythology. Because men who benefit from invisible labor often rewrite themselves as self-made immediately after divorce. Then Mother's Day approached. For years post-divorce, Linda planned the annual family dinner at Bellevue Steakhouse downtown. Private room. 30 guests. Extended relatives. Church friends. Greg. Cheryl. And apparently, me. Interesting invitation, honestly. Because Linda hadn't voluntarily included me at anything since the divorce finalized. Natalie called first. Grandma wants everyone there. Why? Silence. Then carefully. Dad's getting an award from Regional Medical. Of course. Recognition dinner disguised as family gathering. Interesting timing too. Because public praise always intensifies ego performance. I don't think that's a good idea. Natalie interrupted immediately. Please come. Pause. Just trust me. Interesting tone. Not emotional. Strategic. That caught my attention instantly. The next Saturday, Natalie arrived at my apartment carrying 3 things. Laptop. Printed binder. And a small black flash drive. She set them on the kitchen table carefully. I need your permission. Interesting sentence. Because intelligent daughters understand ethics before exposure. For what? To correct the record publicly if he does it again. My stomach tightened immediately. Natalie. He lied to Dylan. Pause. He lied to me. Another pause. He turned you into a punchline. Interesting thing about daughters. Once they fully see their mother's suffering, their loyalty becomes terrifyingly precise. I looked down at the binder slowly. Tabs labeled year by year. Financial breakdowns. Investment histories. Contribution percentages. 16 years reduced into undeniable mathematics. You prepared all this? Yes. How long have you been working on it? 3 months. 3 months. Interesting. Because while Greg spent 4 years performing victimhood publicly, his daughter quietly audited the entire marriage. I sat down slowly across from her. Heart beating harder now. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Because suddenly, I understood something important. Truth wasn't mine alone anymore. Natalie pushed the flash drive toward me gently. Everything's backed up. Pause. Including Dad's texts. I looked up sharply. What texts? Natalie's expression hardened slightly. The ones where he admits you handled all the finances because he didn't understand that boring stuff. Interesting. Because arrogance makes people careless digitally. Apparently Greg texted Natalie 6 months earlier asking her help setting up investment apps. His exact words. Your mom always handled all that money stuff. I never understood it. Another text. She was obsessive about finances, honestly. Obsessive. Interesting rewrite for competent. Natalie archived everything. Screenshots. Dates. Metadata. And honestly, watching my daughter prepare evidence against her father felt deeply tragic. Not empowering. Not satisfying. Tragic. Because children should inherit recipes and photo albums? Not forensic documentation. 3 days before Mother's Day dinner. Dylan found the binder accidentally. Left open across my dining table. He flipped through 3 pages before looking up slowly. Dad didn't pay for college? I closed my eyes briefly. Interesting thing about truth. Once exposed, it spreads through families faster than lies ever did. He contributed, I answered carefully. But not alone. Dylan kept reading silently. Then suddenly laughed once. Not happy laughter. Disbelief laughter. He doesn't even know the Vanguard password. Honestly? That broke my heart slightly. Because in that moment, my son realized his father's entire public identity rested on a version of masculinity someone else quietly maintained for him financially. Mother's Day dinner arrived warm and humid. Bellevue Steakhouse glowed gold beneath hanging Edison lights and polished glass walls. 30 guests. Wine. Laughter. Steak sizzling across nearby tables. And honestly, the entire room felt like a stage before opening curtains. Natalie arrived carrying the black flash drive inside her purse. Craig had no idea. Linda had no idea. Cheryl definitely had no idea. But my daughter walked into that restaurant already holding 16 years of receipts. Interesting thing about accountants. We rarely raise our voices. We just wait for the numbers to speak at exactly the right moment. And honestly, that moment was less than an hour away. Bellevue Steakhouse smelled like garlic butter and expensive wine. 30 people crowded into the private dining room beneath amber pendant lights and polished oak beams. Mother's Day banners hung beside framed black and white photos of downtown Columbus. And honestly, everything looked warm. Comfortable. Normal. That's the dangerous thing about family humiliation. It usually happens in places designed for celebration. Craig arrived 20 minutes late. Of course he did. Regional Medical Sales Excellence Award.